morning. Welcome to Good Morning Enablement. In this episode, we are focused on the cost of resistance to change in organizations. And we're very grateful today to be joined by James Clayson, who is a seasoned organizational development and change practitioner. I had the great pleasure of working on many projects with James at ServiceNow. So to give you a little bit of background on James, James began his journey in change management as a member of an elite organization or transformation team, actually at Aon, where he played a pivotal role in merger and acquisition efforts, contributing to the creation of Verizon. Then, over the next decade, he built and led an organizational development department for a prominent software company in NYC. In this role, James oversaw critical aspects of client success, including user acceptance, testing, training, and change management, as well as post-go-live support to ensure seamless system adoption. Now, James then moved to LA and took a role at adkar, where he served as the organizational global change leader and established a new change management practice. If that wasn't enough, James then joined Cedars-Sinai Health System as the organizational development and change practitioner leader. There, he built another high-performing change management practice and led a $100 million cost reduction program and spearheaded the implementation of a new HR shared services center. Now, when I met James, he was bringing his expertise to ServiceNow when he again developed a new change management practice and led a complex customer success transformation project, amongst other key initiatives, which I was privileged and lucky to work with James during that time. That is why James is here in this episode for a Good Morning Enablement. So recently, I am very excited to share with you that he launched his own company, his own corporation called Onboard Business Solutions. And we'll put the link in the description for you in case you want to reach out to James to help you on your projects. And he's dedicated to helping organizations navigate complex transformations, build sustainable change capabilities, and empower individuals to thrive in an ever-changing world. Now, I wanted to share James's background with you because if there's anyone who has had hands-on experience of the change to resistance in organizations, that would be James. And with that said, let's get into it, James. And I'm going to ask you some questions so we can really tease out that experience for our viewers. So in your experience, what are the most common forms of resistance to change and why do they happen? Why do they arise?
Sure. Well, hello, Maria. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate the introduction. Today our topic, resistance to change, is particularly fascinating because it deals with human behavior. So it draws upon so many different resources and data that we need to incorporate, to really come up with a change strategy to overcome that resistance to change. So when we're talking about overcoming resistance to change, we're really talking about impacting or changing somebody's behavior. And as any parent or neuroscientist will tell you, impacting human behavior is a complex and challenging occurrence. There's just, again, just so many different sort of fields of study that you can pull from in order to try to attack this scenario. So for example, just putting today's talk together, I pulled from a little bit of Richard Beckhardt, a little bit of John Cotter, a little from the Prosty Institute and adkar, a little bit of one of our professors and Chris Worley, a little bit of David Rock, who's really heavily into the neuroscience of change. Also incorporated a lot of behavioral economics, things like loss aversion principle and status quo bias. And then just within the neuroplasticity or neuroscience of change arena, there's incredible insights now in why people engage or they disengage. Speaking of engagement, when we talk about driving behavior, we're also talking about various theories of engagement. So we're getting into things like Hackman and Oldman's famous job characteristics model, which really is sort of an org design thing. It looks at the way we design work or jobs that maximize engagement. Speaking of engagement, we're also talking about Daniel Pink's motivators, autonomy, mastery, purpose. When we're speaking of motivation, we're also talking about things like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, which look at our individual reward systems. And then you also have to look at organizational context because behavior is often owned within specific functions in an organization. So for example, in HR alone, you're typically looking at things like performance management, employee engagement programs, reward systems, team dynamics, leadership development programs, manager training programs. So all of these things can help drive and impact human behavior within an organization. And so when we talk about creating a resistance management strategy, it's not a simple topic. And there's a lot of sort of different influences that we need to include in these. And so that's why I find this such a fun and fascinating topic.
You know, that sounds like a symptom of the pain. There's a lot of information that you've shared with us so far, but one of the things that you kind of hinted at was culture. And I'm curious to understand that a little bit more. Can you kind of like help us understand, does culture help drive the resistance to change? I'm just kind of double clicking into it.
Yeah, it's a great question, Maria. A lot of times there's strong indicators that there's resistance to change within the organizational culture long before you even sort of kick off a specific initiative. This is where you get a lot of sort of theories around what they call a legacy of failure, or in some cases, too much success can also drive a lot of resistance, right? Because it's sort of the we know what's best mentality, and oftentimes that can be a challenge as well. The model that I like to think of when you think of organizational culture and resistance to change is one of the frameworks is called the iceberg model. So if you can imagine, sort of the iceberg peeking out of the water, the piece that's peeking out of the water is what we call the observable behaviors. So these are the things that you can actually sort of observe and address directly. But a lot of the things that you're dealing with from a change management perspective are just underneath that water level. So really trying to surface all of those sort of underlying, mentalities and behavior and values and beliefs, and really trying to bring those to the front. That's how you can really sort of approach resistance management from a change management perspective.
Thank you. I mean, that is a lot of good intel for people to understand. And of course, you mentioned all of the rock stars of change. So I'm sure if anyone wants to learn more about them, they can go and Google them. What I'm really curious about is, do you have some examples of how resistance has led to failure of the majority of change projects? Because it seems like that's one of the biggest Achilles.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's get practical, let's get tactical here, right? A lot of my practice has been, I've been involved in these big, hairy change projects. So a lot of the theory is great, but at the end of the day, what I really wanted to focus on today is providing you some examples of some of the things that I've encountered and, some of the mitigation strategies that you can use to really sort of help get around some of these challenges. One of the first and most common forms of resistance, I think that you see, I like to call these resistance plays. So resistance play number one, we'll call this the attribute the unreadiness for the change to training and communications planning. This is an incredibly frustrating form of resistance because usually a lot of the members that are sort of using this tactic were part of the project team or part of the extended project team. So, as part of you building your coalition for the change, hopefully you've involved a lot of these individuals from different functional areas of the business. Hopefully, you've asked for their input in terms of what types of training would be appropriate or what type of processes they will be trained on. You've certainly, hopefully, accounted for them in terms of the communication strategy. So, yes, it is frustrating, but it absolutely comes up. And then a very sort of closely related element of this is what I like to call gaps in the business process or business process inventory. And this is basically, hey, the process that I do wasn't included in the training. It's sort of an easy way to blow up the blow up the change management effort, especially if there's very specific processes that were not included or stand out. And then finally, sort of also related to this group was what I would say that there's a very specific stakeholder group that was missed. So again, this is where a lot of your planning up front for building out your change management plans is important to make sure that you sort of don't miss those.
Absolutely. I mean, this is so interesting. And I have seen these type of things play out in my experience. What's number two?
So number two, I like to call the busy bee scenario. So this often happens when it's for larger, more cross-functional projects where a lot of the executive sponsors will delegate one of their resources to be part of the project. Maybe it's a subject matter expert, maybe it's a proxy for decision-making purposes, but for one reason or another, it's representation of these different functional areas of business to help guide and lead the project. Oftentimes, what happens here, though, is that these dedicated resources, for one reason or another, they don't have the time to participate in the actual change effort. So this is where I call it the busy bee scenario. So these are the individuals that, yeah, they're part of the project team, but they're not showing up to the meetings. They are often disengaged or multitasking during the meetings. So you're really missing key decisions or key input from their functional area of the business. by them not participating or actively participating in it. It's sort of a passive aggressive way of resisting the change from that particular area of the business.
Absolutely understand. Again, super interesting. And I have seen this play out too. Like you said, it would kind of show up as a resistance in the form of a resource who's dedicated to you, cannot help, never show up, don't add any contribution, and don't help you. I have experienced that sadly. I can't wait to hear number three, James. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think number three is fairly related to number two, and I like to jokingly call this one gladiator games. So again, we're looking at these big, hairy, cross-functional changes that are happening in organizations. Where, and again, there's typically a lot of senior leaders or a lot of maybe even C-suite sponsors that are involved in these types of projects. So usually in these situations, there's a ton of ostensible support. There's usually a huge project kickoff meeting with all the leaders there talking about the support for the project or the initiative. But then subsequently, each leader or these sponsors sort of pushes their individual team members to advance, an agenda that might not be necessarily what the original scope or the original business outcome of the project was. It's sort of a roundabout way of trying to get, some of their needs and wants into the project, which is fine as long as it's within the initial scope of the project. I oftentimes use the analogy for this around sort of like a bill being introduced into Congress. You've heard of many times of amendments or riders that get attached to a bill that have nothing to do with the actual bill that was originally proposed. This is probably the closest, version of what I could explain happens many times when these gladiator games that happen at these.
Excellent. I mean, sometimes hearing the truth is super eye opening. So, for any of you listening, I also am hearing that organizations' biggest Achilles heel is implementing change. And I would say, after hearing, all of your different analogies here, James, I would say the resistance to change predominantly is coming from within. And whether you want to hear it or not, it is a form of resistance. This is so compelling, James. Let's continue. We've got the resistance to change, some of the areas that we can focus in on. What about, trying to solve that? You probably can guess my next question. We have heard the top three reasons of resistance. What are the solutions that could be implemented? How can we help our listeners to mitigate the risks of resistance from within or from without?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of very simple, practical solutions, or what we like to call mitigation strategies. The first one we talk about training and communications planning. Obviously, the solution for this is to have a really solid training and communications plan up front. But more importantly, be sure to review those plans with all of your key stakeholders. One of the most important elements I would suggest is to make sure that you have a steering committee and that these plans, specifically those plans, are reviewed in every single steering committee meeting so that you can help mitigate some of the, hey, this was never, this process or this stakeholder group or this particular training module was never incorporated. We weren't aware that was going to be part of it. So preparation, obviously, with training and communications. For the second one, the busy bee scenario, this is tough. It's really tough to diagnose and mitigate, Maria, because a lot of times, by the time you realize it's happening, it's a lot of times it's too late, right? So, because it's a passive aggressive behavior. So, one of the tactics you can consider if you do recognize that it's happening is consider negotiating with this resource, making them a more visible lead within the project. So giving them more responsibility. The golden rule in change management is to really bring people along with changes to involve them. And so I really believe that if you can engage them or involve them in a process, really give them more authority or status in the change initiative, you're more likely to bring them along and get more out of them as a resource towards the project.
Fantastic.
The third set for the gladiator games, the mitigation strategy here is probably a little bit more straightforward. Assuming you can identify the behavior early and intervene. Really, because this is a scope creep play, your best mitigation strategy here should emphasize the original business outcomes or goals of the project. In some cases, if they are really great suggestions or there's very specific needs for different functional areas of the business, but that maybe wasn't part of the original project plan or stated business outcomes, those are the types of things that you can maybe gently pushed to a parking lot, or in many cases, I've seen these things pushed to maybe a rollout two or phase two of the project, so that you can really keep that laser focus on the original outcomes for the phase one. So those are two great tactics. The other thing is to really keep focused on, you hear the term an MVP, or a minimal viable product. Making sure that you can really stay focused on, sort of the minimal viable product, so that you can build momentum and get some wins early in the project. Then you're going to be able to expand that scope and pull in some of those, those suggestions that maybe weren't part of the original solution.
That's fantastic. I mean, we've discussed some of the top reasons for resistance to change in organizations, and you've given us some very solid solutions or strategies that we could utilize to move them forward. Do you have any final thoughts, for our listeners to help them in their endeavors when dealing with resistance and implementing strategies, or anything you can, give them any tips before we try to round this off?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm trying to provide some very practical suggestions here in terms of sort of the larger, more philosophical approach to mitigating some of these challenges. David Rock has a fantastic framework. It's called the SCARF framework. If you're not familiar with it, sure, certainly we won't have time to get into it now, but it really does look at why people engage or sort of disengage with any individual process. Now it doesn't always necessarily mean resistance, but these are really interesting, and they're tied to sort of the neuroplasticity, or the neuroscience of our brain. And what he would suggest is that when you're looking at how to try to engage people, you really want to focus on whether or not you're threatening their status within this project. Is there any kind of, the brain loves certainty, right? So are we introducing a lot of uncertainty, and how can we create more certainty? And that's again where a good change plan comes into play. Making sure that you're respecting people's autonomy, which is the A in his SCARF model. It's interesting. Autonomy is found, Daniel Pink, like almost every prominent author that talks about trying to engage people and things uses autonomy. Relatedness is the R in the SCARF model, and of course fairness, because people are more likely to engage if they're being treated fairly in any types of process. So again, won't go too deeply into it, but again, it's Dr. David Rock. I believe it's the Neuro Leadership Institute that he is still sort of heading up. It's a great institute. It's a great framework to take a look at. So that would be kind of the leave behind that I would suggest that you take a look at after this session.
That's fantastic. James, it's not enough time to share all of your expertise. You have many, many years of expertise and some great tips and tricks and learning strategies for our audience. So it's been a joy to hear from you about the role in resistance in change, and also double clicking in. Thank you for sharing the frameworks and the strategies that will really help you, if you're listening, to assist you in driving certainty and avoiding resistance. Now, if you want to learn more about change management or organizational development, just put some comments and we will make sure that James gets back to you so you can continue to explore the topic with him directly. In the meantime, as James has mentioned, we will put the link to the SCARF model in the description so you can go ahead and download that and further explore. James, thank you so very much. We can't wait to hear from you again, but please go ahead and leave us all the comments, what you liked, what you don't like, so we can continue to bring you these thought leaders and experts in the areas that you work on every single day. Now, you know what to do. Please hit the subscribe button and like so that we can continue to bring you these thought leaders and experts. Thank you. And again, thank you, James. What an absolute pleasure to hear from you.
Thank you, Maria. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.